Have you ever noticed that getting what you want doesn't always, make you happy? That sometimes chasing that next thing, the next purchase, the next promotion, the next social media high, just leaves you feeling even more empty? Well, it turns out a 16th century mystic, St. John of the Cross, had a ton to say about this. We're going to dive into a surprisingly modern take on the hidden dangers of our everyday desires.
Right off the bat, the text hits us with this incredible image. I mean, just picture it. You're digging all day in the hot sun for water, but your well is just full of leaks. You're completely exhausted, and you're still thirsty? He says this is exactly what it feels like when we try to quench our spiritual thirst with worldly things. It's just a recipe for fruitless, exhausting effort.
So here's our game plan. First, we got to figure out what the author even means by appetites. Then, we'll explore the two big ways they mess with us. First, by creating this sense of emptiness, and second, by actively tormenting us. After that, we'll see how this whole thing traps us in a vicious cycle, which all leads to a final, pretty wild paradox about satisfaction itself.
All right, let's get into it. To really get what this is all about, we have to start with the most basic question. What on earth is an appetite in this context?
Okay, so we're not just talking about being hungry for a sandwich here. For this author, an appetite is any inordinate attachment, and that word is key, inordinate, to what he calls a creature. That means any created thing, like possessions, status, even experiences. The core conflict is when we try to find our ultimate fulfillment in those things instead of what he calls the Creator, or God. It's a fundamental choice about where you place your heart.
So the text sets up this huge conflict. It basically says these two forces are total opposites, like oil and water. They can't exist in the same space. You can't be chasing the temporary sensory world of creatures and also expect to feel a deep spiritual fullness. One is always going to crowd the other out.
And that leads us directly to the first major harm these appetites cause. The author calls it a privative harm, which is just a fancy way of saying it's about what we lose. It's the harm of emptiness, of being deprived of something truly good because we're so busy chasing after something else.
Okay, so this is a really provocative comparison, right? It's designed to be a little shocking. He uses this biblical analogy to draw a super stark line between two ways of living. But what does he actually mean, comparing people to dogs?
So here's how he breaks down that metaphor. The argument is that when we pursue fulfillment through worldly things, these creatures, it's like choosing to eat crumbs off the floor. Sure, you might get a little taste here and there, but you're going to be constantly hungry, always wanting more, because you're missing out on the actual feast that's happening right there at the main table.
Right, so it's not just about the emptiness that these appetites create. The author says they also inflict a second, positive harm. Now, when he says positive, he doesn't mean good, he means something that is actively added to your life. And in this case, what's being added is torment and suffering.
He breaks this torment down into 5 specific things. These desires, he says, make us weary. They torment us with constant craving. They darken our minds, defile our spirit, and at the end of the day, they just make us weaker. And this is just such a perfect way to explain it. The source uses this incredibly relatable image of a restless child who's just never content. No matter what you give them, they immediately want something else. The appetites just churn up the soul, never letting it rest. Honestly, it sounds a lot like the endless scroll of a social media feed, just this constant, tiring state of wanting the next.
So let's look at how this all builds into a totally self-defeating cycle. This is where the logic gets really counterintuitive, but it's absolutely fascinating.
Here we go! Another fantastic metaphor. Chasing our desires, he says, is like having a fever. You feel this intense, burning thirst, but every sip of water you take, every attempt you make to satisfy that craving, actually makes the thirst worse. It's a temporary relief that's just fueling the underlying sickness. So this slide really breaks down that vicious cycle. Step 1, an appetite pops up, a desire. Step 2, you try to scratch that itch with some creature, a new gadget, a little bit of praise, some fleeting pleasure. But here's the trap. Step 3, instead of going away, that underlying hunger actually grows. And the result? Step 4, you're left not just unsatisfied, but even more tired and weighed down by a desire that's now bigger than it was before. And to really hammer this point home, the text uses one last, really powerful image: fire. See, we think satisfying a desire will put it out, right? Like pouring water on a flame. But the author says no, it's the exact opposite. Giving in is like throwing another log on the fire. You are literally feeding the very thing you want to extinguish, making it burn hotter and brighter.
All of this builds to the central, mind-bending conclusion of the whole argument. It all comes down to the paradox of satisfaction.
So what happens when the object of your desire is finally gone? When the fire has burned through all the wood? You'd think there'd be some relief, right? But the text says no, you're actually in a worse spot. You're left exhausted, because now your hunger is even greater, but its temporary food source is all gone. You are literally weaker and emptier than when you started. This quote just nails it. It sums up the entire paradox perfectly. The very act of trying to find satisfaction in these worldly things, these creatures, is the one thing that guarantees we will be dissatisfied. Because by feeding on what only makes us hungrier, we turn our backs on the only thing the author claims can ever truly satisfy us.
So, we're left with this really challenging idea. A text from over 400 years ago is basically describing our modern hedonic treadmill, this constant chase for satisfaction that might be the very source of our restlessness. And that leaves us with a huge final question. If feeding our desires is the trap, then what's the way out?